Today we'll say something about The Mimic Man, which is one of the early novels of Naipaul. Even A House for Mr. Bishwas is. It predates The Mimic Man, but this Mimic Man is significant not only thematically it shares themes with A House for Mr. Bishwas and other such novels, but certain stylistic or rather we can say technical issues are also there. It has been said that it is Naipaul's first and possibly the only very serious novel. There is very little space of humor here, and then there is a mixture between fictional and fiction in the sense of novel and non-fictional elements, which is said by critics, but it is a very precarious position. And then it is in the form of autobiography. It is an autobiographical novel on two counts, according to me. First of all, evidently, it is an autobiographical novel uh, of a fictional character called Ralph Singh, who is in a way the protagonist as well as the narrator. So definitely it is a fictionalized autobiography. But secondly and more importantly, many of the things that happens in Ralph's life has also close parallels in Naipaul's life. Studying in England, for example, being born in a colonial country, so on and so forth, or say kind of his dissatisfaction with political ideologies while Ralph sings the characters. While Naipaul also had been critical of many political regimes, he also was not a hardcore political ideologist, unlike, let us say, Senghor, whom we discussed in our earlier poem, or even Gugi Wathiongo. Naipaul has more like a Levisite kind of openness before life, a general openness before life. Though this is very controversial to say this in this post theoretical world, but right now possibly the world is post theoretical, so we might as well revive Lewis. I want to bring two things to this text as our tools of theoretical reading. First is exile. In addition to autobiographical elements, which we'll come to again later in our second major point, the first major theoretical point that I want to add to it is that of the exile. And here there is no better text at this moment than the essay named Reflections on Exile by Edward Said. I will give a link to the essays, online text just in the comment or in the about section below. So the very first line says, Edward Said in that essay, exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. We might say all great literature is about exile. Ramayana, Ram is exiled. Mahabharata, Pandavas are exiled. In Iliad, the soldiers coming from Greece, exiled in a way in Troy, and only, Odyssey is more directly the story of an exile, but return of the exile rather, but then still it is exile. So on and so forth. In modern times also, this is more particular. According to Said, in fact, the entire modern English or European literature is a work of exiles of various kinds. Uh, T.S. Eliot was an American, became a naturalized citizen of England. Same with, in a way, W.B. Yeats, who was an Irish person. James Joyce, also from Ireland, we have read his dilemma with Ireland expressed through the persona of Stephen Dedalus in a portrait of the artist as a young man, so on and so forth. I mean, exile became a very predominant problem in the modern age due to colonialism. While earlier exiles, though I have already said about Rama and Mahabharata, etc., they were in a way part of the natural process or they were part of the kingly design. No in between, I think. But then in the post hyphen colonial here, post colonial world, that way, exiles are a phenomenon you cannot avoid. Most of us, even those of us who haven't moved to other places physically, we are also exiled by our education, English education, about which I have spoken in that poem, A Far Cry from Africa. Mm, where to choose? This is very similar, you know, Mimic Man. So the title itself signifies that we try to mimic, imitate. Ralph Singh, his actual name is Ranjit Kripal Singh, but it's very Indian. He is born, in Britain, though of Indian parents, but Ralph is much more European. So he compresses Ranjit Kripal Singh to Ralph Singh. During the colonial periods, it happens. I don't mean offense to many of our surnames. Sometimes they were anglicized by the British, sometimes we anglicized them in our aspiration, you know, uh, for colonial identity. So the mimic man, but finally that mimicry is not successful in a way. We have here mixed Said with Bhabha. Mimicry is Bhabha's theory, but Bhabha was influenced by this novel. 1967, and Bhabha's theory of mimicry was to come much later. So in many ways, fictions, you know, anticipate theory. So we go back to Said. Said had said another very important thing about exiles. Exiles feel, therefore, an urgent need to reconstitute their broken lives, usually by choosing to see themselves as part of a triumphant ideology or a restored people. So when you are exiled, even culturally exiled, so what do you do is, you know you want to restore or remake your history, your identity, by reference to a triumphant ideology. It happened in India with the Aryan thing. Many of us tried to believe that we were Aryan. Still date many of us believe. But whether this Aryan is actually a race, or in Sanskrit it is used as a kind of adjective for a refined person, there is a great doubt over there. But then we always identify, common people, we like to identify ourselves to triumphant ideology. That Aryan thing also comes in the Mimic Man. Naipaul is very much aware, and he provides a critique of that also. When we go to the details of the novels in subsequent videos, I'll elaborate. A novel is a huge thing. The novel is the epic of the modern world. As Jörg Lukács said, the novel is the epic of a world forsaken by God. So unlike a poem, which we analyzed earlier, a novel or substantial text, it includes so many themes, so many ideas. It is not a Chetan Bhagat novel. I'm sorry to say that. So we cannot conclude it in one video. So here I am trying to focus on one aspect, exile, and then autobiography. Now, it is not only that Ralph Singh is an exile. Just try to understand. V.S. Naipaul is also an exile. Though now technically, I mean, now means is not there. He became a naturalized British citizen, but then he is of mixed ancestry, Indian person in Britain. So English is not his mother tongue. Those features. So he's also an exile in many ways. So what happens to Ralph Singh is representative of what happens to Naipaul also. Then further, within that, if you are a thinking man, I have made this point earlier also, then your sense of belonging or non-belonging rather becomes more acute. It has been going on since long. Say Hamlet doesn't belong to his world because he is a university person, he thinks. These days, of course, I don't know how many of us, can encourage thinking in a free way, in a free state, another novel by Naipaul. Because now resources are limited, things are online. I mean that because epidemic is there at the back of us. So anyway, but we have to grapple with the idea that in exile, as a free thinker, what happens to Ralph Singh also happens to Naipaul to a great extent. However, Naipaul is hugely successful, at least in the eyes of the world. Ralph Singh is an unsuccessful person in his marriage also. There is again parallel. I don't want to elaborate. Though we are no longer bound by the death of the author theory, but anyway, we don't want to elaborate the author openly. Let the text speak for itself. Now, I hope you have understood this point that Ralph Singh is part of Naipaul too. So that way also it is autobiographical. Uh, so like Aryan myth and all, the autobiography itself or fictional autobiography, I mean the Mimic Man, the text itself, as Said has said, this way Said is prophetic in regard to this text also. Here, Ralph Singh, the fictionalized narrator, he is trying to, write his memoir, and by doing that, impose order on his chaotic world. So, writing can also be a strategy of imposing order. In life, things exist mostly in bits and parts. When you write a neat thing, things become more compact. Unfortunately, this cannot be achieved. This is a part of the narrative strategy, obviously. The novel or the fictionalized autobiography is as chaotic as Ralph Singh's life. It starts in the present, goes back to the past in the second section, again comes to the present, and none of this section has any kind of transcendence which takes the writer above. Writer means, I mean the fictional writer here, narrator, not Naipaul. I mean Ralph Singh, who is the apparently narrator in the. So there is no redeeming feature which we can identify within the text, which puts that character at peace. Now we come to our second major point. As I said in the beginning, there are two major points. One is of exile, and associated to that is autobiography. Now we come to another major point and another major theorist, who is Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson, I have collected the essay here in a very important piece. I have referred to it in another of my video also. He has said the name of the essay is Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. In that essay, Frederick Jameson has commented, all third world texts are necessarily, I want to argue, allegorical and in a very specific way. They are to be read as what I will call national allegories. Even when, or perhaps I should say particularly when, their forms develop out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, such as the novel. So it's very clear. There have been resentment against this statement that it is a sweeping generalizations and all that. It is, all novels are possibly not allegories of nationhood, or neither Frederick Jameson has read all the novels of the so-called third world. But so far as the novels that we mostly encounter, in post-colonial literatures, including this Mimic Man, are allegories of nation building, nationhood. He is from a fictional, island called Isabella. Isabella does not exist, but every colonial place or erstwhile colony is an Isabella to some extent or other. So he comes back during the phase of decolonization, but cannot relate to it, forms a government, in collaboration. I mean, his maternal uncle rather forms the government. He becomes a part, but finally is left out. So, what is going on in the process is not only a personal autobiographical narration, but also the process of a nation's coming to term with itself. But which term it is, nobody knows. Let me give another example, a house for Mr. Vishwas. From one point of view, it is the story of a person called Mr. Vishwas, very poor and later, lower middle class person who tries to build a house of his own with little success. But if you read deeply, you know, beyond the lines, not between the lines not enough, beyond the lines, then you will find that you will not fail to notice that, you know, every colonized person, leaving the very rich apart, a rich person can have his home anywhere. It was said by Moll Flanders long before Karl Marx. You know, Moll Flanders means Daniel Defoe. In Moll Flanders, with money in one's pocket, one can have his home, eh, in any part of the world. A classic statement of Moll Flanders, which many people have not read enough. So I'm bringing it to the fore now. Anyway, but for 80-90% of people, they're all Mr. Vishwases, at least of that generation, immediately after decolonization. We come to Midnight Children, shame, confused identity, that fragmentation. So again, if we go to Australia, Peter Carey's novel Illywaker, for example, which is a classic Australian text of black humor, it is slightly later to 1980. Its final thesis is that the Australian nationhood is a lie, managed by multinational companies from America and Japan. So what we are seeing this in all these novels. In a lecture recently presented in GC College, I have stretched Frederick Jamison's theory, back to Bankim Chandra. All his novels. In fact, he first started the novel genre in Indian literature for all practical purposes. Technically, you might find one or two novelists before him, but those did not make the impact. His novels like Raj Singha, Durgesh Nandini, Anandamot, most of all, from which we get our national anthem, song called Bande Mataram. These are all attempts at nation building. Tagore's Goda, Ghare Baire. Similarly, those were slightly pre-colonial, and what Naipaul is describing here is a hypothetical post-colonial situation, here post-colonial. But if we use the unhyphenated term post-colonial, as I often use, it will include the pre-colonial as well as the post-independent. You go to your other text, The Devil on the Cross. What is happening there? In post-colonial Africa or post-independence Africa, a handful of opportunists have taken the baton from the hands of the British, and they are exploiting Africans. Us, I mean, as we often say, now things have changed a lot. People are conscious, government is saying about transparency, but still, many opportunists are there all over the world. The kind of democracy that you have in America or England, you cannot expect in third world countries because we have been colonies for a very long period of time. So all these writers have argued this. This is not my only personal point. You read The Devil on the Cross, the amount of corruption in post-colonial, post-colonial Africa, Kenya particularly. At the same time, the penchant for Englishness, which I'll directly relate to Mimic Man. If you remember, in The Devil on the Cross, a school was opened initially, which was notified as a very Desi kind of school, African Desi, with all native teachers and everything. No student turned up. Then immediately the school's name was changed. I don't remember exactly, and it was advertised that European or European trained teachers are there. A lot of students. So Mimic Man, yeah, we have in our place and elsewhere. New Cambridge School, or say we can say, Botterstall, Oxford Academy, or different kinds of things. Yeah, half British, half Indian. Now, for Baba, this is a point to in a way celebrate. Not so for Naipal or for the just the previous text I dealt with, a far cry from Africa. So try to understand these 2 points. That one is that it is the story of an exile written in the form of an autobiography, and also at the same point of time, this is directly an allegory of nation building in uh, the erstwhile colonies right after the period of colonization. Whether Jamison's theory is true of all all post-colonial nations or not, we do not know. Post-colonial novels or not, we do not know. But definitely, this is true of the Mimic Man at least, and the Devil on the Cross, the other texts that we'll study. So today, I think this much of theoretical background is enough, which will help you to read the text from a different point of view and interpret it. Not different, I mean, these are rather in line with what the main argument of the text is. Um, these are additional tools. I think they will enrich your understanding. And study of literature, good study of literature is always about comparison and analysis. Another point I should mention today, that of religion. Religion plays a very important role in the erstwhile colonies, because we did not have the kind of Renaissance or Enlightenment that Europe had, though we may have contributed to this. I am aware India had very strong atheistic traditions too. Charvak, Jainism, Buddhism, these are basically called Nastika philosophies, though there is a nuance between Nastic and atheism, but for practice. But then these things did not thrive here somehow or other, you know, kings. So religion becomes a very important tool. During just before independence, Vivekananda, Dayananda, they tried to reform Hinduism. There was also question of mimicry there. Uh, Borrowing good elements from Christianity to stop conversion, etc. But anyway, it was a powerful tool. Uh, Even after independence, many spiritual leaders and then Babas have emerged. Some are, some are, revered philosophers like Raman Maharshi, etc. Some have dubious origins, and some have landed in jails recent years. It is true about all religions, not only Hinduism. Similarly, we can see the point there made by Naipaul in the Mimic Man. In the middle section, if you read, at one point of time, his father, Ralph Singh's father, who was a school teacher, he turns into a Baba, a saint. Whereas in inputs of socialism is also there. He lives in almost a ashram, which is a commune kind of touch of communism. I am reminded a book by Jaydeep Chakrabarty, which is again controversial about Moscow থেকে Pondicherry, etc. So how at certain point of time, I personally don't object to this. If you take best values from different aspects, whether communism or spiritual, what is the harm? But anyway, so he becomes a saint, has a lot of following, and finally he is murdered by his own brother-in-law, that's Cecil. And when Ralph Singh gets the news in England, his response is all the more shocking. He gets to read it in a newspaper. Those were not the days of mobile, WhatsApp, and all this as we are doing right now. And the reaction is so fragmented, so inhuman. To address that, finally, while having a wife, he, in spite of having a wife, he, to absorb the shock of that news that his father has been shot dead, he consummates with a prostitute, I mean public woman. at that night. So it is not kind of sexual enjoyment, it is pathetic degradation of human values, feelings, passions, and emotions. Total, compartmentalization, or say rather fragmentation. All this has happened due to colonialism. As I say this, I also understand that even my lecture or speech is being fragmented. Part of it is done in designed way because I'm speaking to very mature PG audience, I believe. So you can do this. But part of the fragmentation is obviously due to the ongoing, uh, you know, thing. We are not trained in this trick. I can speak to all of you for hours directly in a class, but this way, holding the camera, recording my own lecture, and doing, looking up at the computer for relevant texts times, it's good experience, but it's bizarre slightly at times, I feel, but I'm enjoying it. It may be queer also in the original sense of the term. Do let me know how you liked my lecture. Please feel free to comment. Remember these two essays, two tropes of exile and of national allegory, with autobiographical element in between so far as mimicry is concerned. We will come with a plot summary kind of thing in our next lecture after a few days. Thank you.